Hello, and welcome to the 2024 Georgia Wellness Summit. We are delighted to have you join us for this virtual event in its fourth year. This year, our theme is Health in Action, focusing on our vital pillars that include women and children's health, maternal mortality, and human trafficking. The Georgia Commission on Women is dedicated to improving the lives of Georgia women and their families across this great state of Georgia. We are 15 individuals appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House for 4-year terms, representing all regions across the state. Our work is to work tirelessly across the state of Georgia on health, education, and employment for women. Today, you will have the opportunity to hear from leading experts, engage in meaningful discussion, and learn actionable steps to improve health outcomes in our communities. Thank you for being here, for your commitment to health and wellness. Together, we can make a significant impact, create a healthier, safer Georgia for all.
Hello, and welcome to the 2024 Georgia Wellness Summit. I am Dr. Michelle Nelson, one of your hosts for today. We're excited to have you join us virtually for this important event. But before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that there are chapter times in the video for easy reference during playback. This will allow you to navigate through the sessions and revisit key points at your convenience. To kick off our summit, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Chandler Padgett. Chandler is an assistant nursing professor in the School of Nursing at Columbus State University, known as CSU. She has taught for 4 years in the undergraduate nursing program and currently teaches in the graduate nursing MSN F&P program at CSU. In 2020, Chandler was honored with the Outstanding Teacher Award at CSU and was the recipient of the 2021 CSU Excellence in Teaching Award. In 2023, she was nominated for the Teaching Excellence Award at the university level and proudly received the Honors College Award for Outstanding Mentorship. Chandler also serves on numerous committees at CSU, including the University Internal Review Board, Study Abroad Committee, the IDEA Committee, the College of Education and Health Professions, known as the COEHP Curriculum Committee, the COEHP Graduate Council, the COEHP Honors Education Committee, and chairs the Graduate Curriculum Committee. Please join me in welcoming Chandler Padgett as she shares her expertise and insights with us today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Chandler Padgett, and I'm so grateful to be able to have the opportunity to speak with each of you today. So before we get into this amazing topic that we're going to dive deep into and really target, I would love to kind of give you just a little background of myself so you know where I'm coming from and what my background is. So I currently teach full-time at Columbus State University. I've been an assistant professor there for 5 years, which is amazing. I've taught several years in the undergraduate program, and I currently teach in the nurse practitioner program at Columbus State University. I also have nursing experience in the ICU, and then becoming a nurse practitioner, I have nurse practitioner experience as a hospitalist as well as in the hospice settings. And then currently I own Glow Medical Aesthetics, and so I work part-time doing injectables such as fillers and toxins part-time. But my passion is advocacy, and my passion is really helping us to be able to bring our community at the local, state, and national levels up, to raise everyone up, to help educate on what's currently going on in our communities. So I would love to also tell you a little bit about how I'm active within our communities. So I currently serve on the local and regional DFACS boards out of Columbus, Georgia, and for the Columbus, Georgia region. I'm also so grateful to serve as the Executive Vice President for UAPRN of West Georgia, which is the West Georgia chapter of the United Advanced Practice Registered Nurses. And I'm also so thankful to serve currently in my 3rd term as the legislative chair for the Georgia NAPNAP chapter, and that's the National Association of Pediatric Nurse Practitioners. So as you can see, there's a variety of experience clinically, a variety of passions as far as advocacy, and so I would love to now dive into this topic that is such a massive topic that not only we're going to address today, but that we're addressing at the local, state, and national levels. So the topic today is, could human trafficking happen to you? There's a large misconception that human trafficking, it would never happen to me because I don't go to places like XYZ or I don't hang out with people like XYZ. But I think it's so important to bring awareness to the fact that this can truly happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. So please don't ever feel like you're able to let your guard down because you truly don't know. Sex trafficking is considered to be the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, patronizing, or solicitation of a person for commercial sex or labor. So this doesn't have to be sex trafficking. This can also be labor trafficking and of the sort. So this next slide is really harnessing the three major pillars for this year's 2024 Georgia Commission on Women's Wellness Summit. So these four pillars, as you can see here, are focusing on women and children's health, as well as maternal mortality and human trafficking. So we're really going to dive into human trafficking during today's presentation. So before we get too deep into the statistics currently for Georgia, cities within Georgia, and our nation as a whole, I want to do a little overview with each of you on what human trafficking is, so what it can be considered. Once we're educated to know what it entails, we're able to be better suited to help stop it from happening and mitigate it from happening in the first place. So human trafficking can be considered sex trafficking, which we know and have heard of, I'm sure. Of course, labor trafficking, and this would be as far as working underage and so on and so forth. Domestic servitude, slavery, and sexual exploitation. So this also can be considered pornography and in that industry as well. So it's important to also understand, as we spoke on earlier, this can happen to anyone at any age. However, statistics do show us that some individuals may be a higher likelihood depending on their socioeconomic status, their poverty level, their sex, and their race. Okay, we're going to dive into that a little bit later. So the first question I want to ask you is, who is being targeted? And I really want you to take a second and really ponder in your mind, when you think of the targets or the potential victims, who you are seeing in your mind. Okay, we're going to dive into this. So my first question is, what is the average age of individuals being sold pertaining to sexual purposes? Okay, so this, of course, is the sexual exploitation, the pornography, and sex trafficking. So what do you believe is the average age? I'm going to give you a second to think about it. So it's 13 to 14 years old. Now, I don't know if you're like me. I personally thought it might have been a little older, but so just know we want to help integrate this information into the school systems, into individuals before they would reach this age, of course, during and after, to really help our school systems be set to mitigate this before it happens. Who or what populations are the most likely to be targeted? So we talked about it doesn't matter what age you are, what race, what gender, that truly anyone can potentially be a target. However, statistics show us that some individuals may have a higher likelihood. So that's what we're about to dive into. So individuals who are experiencing poverty, who may need money or who may be seeking money, may be more likely to be targeted because they can be falsely lured into a sex trafficking scheme if they think they can get a little money and they need money, right? Or anything of the sort. So people who are experiencing poverty can be at a higher risk because of their desires as well, right? So also unsafe living conditions. Again, this goes back to socioeconomic status. If they hear promises of a better living condition or clean water or a safe bed to sleep in, then they also can be lured more easily. It's also important to understand that people who can also be trapped and controlled, again, through different threats, through false promises, and through debt. So an individual, as you could imagine, that may have debt may be more likely to be lured into this scheme if they're promised money. Someone who doesn't have food or water that's clean may be lured into a scheme such as this by these false promises. So again, really educating our school systems, our communities at the local, state, and national level on how to prevent this before it happens. Believe it or not, the International Labor Organization estimates that more than 20.9 million victims of sex trafficking are worldwide. 20.9 million. That is just such an astounding number. And we're so grateful for First Lady Marty Kemp, who has really taken this by storm and harnessed this current issue. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later as well. In June 2010, there was a study that found that sex trafficking victims, the percentages broken down into different races. So buckle your seatbelts because this is really interesting. So out of the races of African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, and Asian, which race do you feel was most likely to be trafficked? And you can say that loud. Okay, so I'm going to break this down. This is really interesting. So African American men and women, so keep in mind this is not just women, this is men and women, were found to be sex trafficked at a 40% rate. Okay, which is really high, right? That's almost 50%. So a 40% rate, while Caucasians were 26%, Asians were 17%. So you guessed it, that leaves our Hispanic population at 63%. Y'all, this is astounding. And the best thing is knowing data like this can really help us educate not only these various populations in the school systems and in our communities, but just to bring awareness to this is so incredible. So now you might be asking yourself, where is sex trafficking taking place? Now we know who can be a victim, but where are these victims potentially being reined in? So I want to first draw attention to the fact that pornography and illicit spas and massage businesses were the #1 most common venue where sex trafficking occurs in the United States. Okay. So, and I know you've probably grown up hearing of, oh, massage parlors and this, but just know that in the United States, so nationwide, illicit spas and massage parlors were #1 for these occurrences. Broken down from that, the 3 most likely places in the United States where sex trafficking occurs are motels and hotels. Now, this also can be motels and hotels where someone goes to stay in that motel and hotel and unknowingly is then trafficked. This also is taken into account people who meet online or on the internet and they meet at a hotel or motel. They're also placed in this category as well. Again, locations arranged on the internet. So this could be Starbucks, Chick-fil-A, places we go all the time where you might be meeting someone for the first time and then you're catfished. Okay. So keep this in mind as well. In addition to commercial brothels, and this entails or is the big overlying umbrella for massage parlors, spas, and etc. In addition to what we've already addressed, other places of note would be places of erotic services, which we've mentioned, massage parlors, the internet, right? So meeting individuals on the internet and speaking back and forth and meeting up as we've spoken of. Also, pre-existing relationships. This is something that people don't normally think about because when we think about someone being sex trafficked, we don't automatically think that this could be our friends or family or people that we know, but unfortunately it can be. So also understand that pre-existing or prior relationships and also future relationships, this can occur as well. Also, strip clubs and truck stops are other places that also are known for sex trafficking. So just keep this in mind as well, not only when you're educating others in regard to prevention, but as you're out and about, keeping your awareness up and your eyes open in case you were to see anything that's suspicious. So now we're going to talk about who these traffickers can be. So I know we spoke in the last slide. I don't know if you're like me, but my initial reaction is not thinking of friends and family because you feel like that's your safe zone. Your friends are safe, your family are safe. If they're in your circle of trust, then they're safe and you can trust them. I'm not saying not to, but just be aware that, believe it or not, a fair percentage of individuals who are sex trafficked through their friends or their so-called friends, who they think are their friends at the time, family members, as well as strangers, which if you're like me, this was the category that I felt was my automatic understanding was strangers. Also acquaintances, maybe people you go to school with or someone that you know lives down the street, your neighbor. So acquaintances that you're familiar with that may or may not be in your close friend circle. Also, those who are seeking to monopolize on a situation and preying on the vulnerable. So we spoke earlier of people who may have debt. So maybe they're looking for a way to make money, and this seems like an easy way to make money, depending on what they're being promised, and then they're pulled in. Okay, so keep in mind, these sex traffickers a lot of times are just looking at how to prey on these victims and how to pull them in. In 2023, 4.5 million people in the world were victims of forced exploitation. Now, this can be pornography, this can be sex trafficking. This is, of course, the umbrella of sexual exploitation. But 4.5 million in the world is a really large number, okay? So we definitely want to help to educate others to tackle this number and decrease it. So you might be asking, this all is very important information, but how does this affect us in Georgia? How does this affect us in our communities? So I'm so glad you asked. So we're going to dive into this as well. So how is this affecting Georgia? So in 2012, helplines received 363 reports. Now keep in mind, this number isn't necessarily individuals who were caught, isn't necessarily individuals who were put behind bars. These are truly just from a hotline, whether it's a text or a phone call or an email. There were 363 reports. So as you know, when you compare 363 compared to the stats we've been seeing, that's amazing to receive that many reports. But in relation to the number where we're actually seeing the presence of this issue, this is a very small percentage of actual reports. In 2013, education, I'm assuming, is a big portion of this that helped really getting out the hotline numbers and emails. So there were 599 reports received in Georgia, which is a great increase from 2012. In 2014, again, you're seeing that increase where you have 626 reports received and 150 were true cases documented. So again, this is amazing and we are making gains. And then as you can see in 2021, I know there's a little jump there. So in 2021, 50,123 tips were received for Georgia Hotline. So I'm so grateful to say that we're bringing awareness to our communities, to the state of Georgia. But again, this is still the tip of the iceberg that we really need to dive deep into our communities to help really understand what's going on, to help individuals who are potentially at risk and prevent any issues in the future. In 2023, there were 129 victims who were rescued, and this is a huge win because, as you know, not only from reports received or actual cases documented, the main thing, if we're unable to prevent it from occurring altogether, would be to rescue these victims. So being able to successfully rescue 129 victims last year was truly, truly amazing. And I also want to make note that 1 week ago in Georgia, it was reported that we have 100% conviction rate in human trafficking cases. So this is so amazing. And again, I'm so grateful for First Lady Marty Kemp, who has really taken this initiative under her belt. And to be able to have 100% conviction rate is truly astounding and a huge step in the right direction. So now we're going to dive into a couple cities in Georgia. So We went from Georgia, the state as a whole. Now we're going to kind of dive into individual cities. But please know that just because a city is not listed in this PowerPoint does not mean it cannot happen in this city, okay? There are a couple of cities that are more known for sex trafficking. Atlanta is a very, very massive hub for sex trafficking. Macon, Georgia as well as Columbus, Georgia, because again, these are close, big cities surrounding Atlanta, not too far from Atlanta as well. So first, we're going to dive into Macon, Georgia. So there was such an issue of sex trafficking going on in Macon, and this is like Bibb County as well. So this was such a great initiative. The school system decided to start a health class survey to really reveal in the school systems the percentage of sex trafficking or what's really going on from the student's point of view. So believe it or not, 13% of 350 students who were surveyed reported they knew someone who sold themselves for sex in the past year. Now, this isn't necessarily saying that they sold themselves. This is saying they know of someone who did. But 13% of 350, that is a lot of students when you're thinking of these school-aged really children who are being exposed to this. 9% of them indicated they know of someone who had been forced to sell themselves. So out of that 13%, 9% felt forced. Now, whether that was through violence or through threats or through gunpoint, it doesn't specify in the survey, but just knowing that 9% of those obviously weren't voluntary, were forced. The other percent were not voluntary, I'm sure as well, but just to know that we're having this type of prevalence and incidents within our cities and within our state and within our nation is astounding and something we definitely want to take part in helping to mitigate. In addition to this, 37 youth in Bibb, Colquitt, and Houston counties were referred to the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia and suspected of being exploited between 2020 and 2023. Now, this is amazing that we were able to have 37 youth that were referred. However, when you think about the fact that this is over a 3-year time span and the fact that this is covering multiple counties, as much of a win as it is to be able to locate these 37 youth, think of the people that we weren't able to hit. Okay, so I think this is what's so important in educating and in really wanting to dive into our communities and help mitigate this issue is understanding that there's so many individuals that we haven't touched to really shed light on this subject. And Bibb County of the 3 encompassed 70% of the referrals. So you can see the issue really being prominent in Bibb County, but of course, primarily any county in any city, okay? Next, we're going to discuss Atlanta, Georgia. Now, as you know, this is a major hub in Georgia, in the state of Georgia. 500 youth were referred for being suspected of exploitation from 2020 to 2023. So this is the same 3-year time span, the same study as you saw in Macon in the previous slide, but rather than 37, it was 500. And again, when you're seeing these statistics, 500 sounds like a great number that we're really helping to hopefully save. But think about the youth and the individuals that we're not accounting for. And that's what I want you to really harness into. A recent study also revealed that sex trafficking in Atlanta is bigger than Seattle, Washington, D.C., and Denver, Colorado combined. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time because it is so hard to even wrap your mind around. But that sex trafficking in Atlanta is such a hub that it is bigger than Seattle, Washington, D.C., and Denver, Colorado combined. So we have a lot of work to do. Now that we've looked at Georgia as a whole and a couple of cities in Georgia, we're going to kind of take an outward perspective and look at our nation as a whole. So in 2014, National Human Trafficking Resource Center received more than 24,000 reports regarding trafficking, and this was a 26% increase. So as you can tell, this is 2014. There's a little jump to 2020, but in 2020, over 1,000 defendants were charged in the court systems for human trafficking. This is a huge win for getting these individuals off the street and hopefully saving countless other individuals' lives. But again, I challenge you to reflect, to celebrate in individuals that were charged and obtained. And in that celebration, also reflect on the individuals who are still ever present out there that we really need to make sure we're educating people to stay safe from. So I want to ask you a couple questions. Y'all know I love questions. So I want to ask you a couple questions. One question is, what percent of the defendants do you believe were male? You can say it out loud. So believe it or not, 92% were male. But obviously that leaves room. There are females. So it doesn't mean you can let your guard down if it's a male or a female who may be approaching you or trying to speak with you online or in person, or as you're educating others, letting them know it can affect any sex, any gender. It can, the person who is potentially going to try and traffic you can be of any sex or any gender. My next question is, what percent do you think had no prior convictions? So these are defendants who were charged for human trafficking, that this was their first offense. What percent do you think this was? Y'all, this took me aback. 66% of individuals who were detained had no prior convictions. So this means that we really have to be aware and vigilant and have discernment, because 66% of people who were sex trafficking others, this was their first conviction. It's truly astounding. This was also a study, this image you're seeing on the right, showing that 50% of sex trafficking victims are less than 16. And we saw the statistics several slides ago saying that primarily the most likely age is 13 to 14 years old. So keep this in mind as well. Of the same study in 2020, 63% of individuals were Caucasian. In addition to that, 18% were African American, 17% were Hispanic, and 95% were US citizens, meaning that only 5% of those who were charged for human trafficking were not citizens. So 95% of that greater than 1,000 number were citizens, 63% were Caucasian, and 66% had no prior convictions. Do y'all see what an issue this is? We really have to hone in and educate our communities. The next slide is showing a 2019 state map of human trafficking cases. So this is really interesting. You can see us in Georgia, all right, and Florida. So you see these major hubs here, Texas as well, and California. Okay, so just being aware of this map, being aware as a nation where we're falling. On the front lines, I think it's really important while we're educating others on, and ourselves and others, on the current incidence and prevalence of sex trafficking, it's also equally as important to celebrate the wins. And so we're so grateful in 2023 to have been allowed the opportunity, right, and for the work and hard work of Attorney General Chris Carr. He worked so hard, and in 2023, he received the Wellspring Living Courage Award, and this is presented on behalf of Delta Airlines and UPS. So he was overseeing, in charge of the Human Trafficking Persecution Unit, and in 2023, they rescued over 116 victims, located countless missing children, and were on the front lines identifying and prosecuting felons who sold others and individuals for sex. So he is such an amazing trailblazer for this, along with First Lady Marty Kemp, and they have really taken this under their wing and really tried to harness this from the inside out to really mitigate any potential future issues with sex trafficking and really educate the public. So we're so grateful for Attorney General Chris Carr and the hard work that he has done. This unit was created in 2019 in support of Governor Brian Kemp and First Lady Marty Kemp. First Lady Marty Kemp also is the co-chair of the Grace Commission. So we'll talk about that in a couple different slides, but this also helps to address human trafficking. But this unit, which again, Attorney General Chris Carr was in charge of, formed to combat human trafficking. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, if someone was to to be obtained or detained, is rescuing possible? Does rescuing occur? So you've seen in several stats throughout this PowerPoint, many people have been rescued, which is such a blessing, but we have many more to rescue, as well as to hopefully mitigate from being detained in the first place. So between 2022 and 2023, there were 245 rescues and 34 convictions, which again, we want to celebrate the wins, but I want to also challenge you to reflect on who we need to rescue and who we need to convict from these numbers. In 2023, there were more than 200 rescues nationwide, which again is such a celebration to be able to save even one life or rescue one life, but to be able to rescue 200 is such a blessing. But when you're looking at 200 nationwide, we talked about the millions and millions of people who have been sex trafficked. So to rescue 200 out of millions, again, is a celebration, but we really have even more work to do. So this is the Grace Commission. We talked a little bit about this in a previous slide, but First Lady Marty Kemp is the co-chair of this Grace Commission, which stands for Georgians for Refuge, Action, Compassion, and Education Commission. Now, this is truly amazing because it's truly spearheading this human trafficking issue that's currently going on, not only statewide, but nationwide and worldwide. So currently estimating that 1.5 million human trafficking victims are in the United States. So again, if you want to be able to really dive into Grace Commission, what their purpose is, what this commission stands for, you're welcome to click on this hyperlink below, or you can look at gracecommission.gov. This is absolutely amazing and you will learn so much. The Grace Commission was formed and created to combat the threat of human trafficking, specifically in the state of Georgia. It's comprised of public officials, law enforcement, for-profit and nonprofit organizations, faith-based institutions, as well as subject matter experts. And they're all working together to be able to tackle human trafficking, seek justice for these victims, and hold people accountable. At this point, hopefully you are charged and you are just feeling this almost burden of what's going on in our communities and in our state and in our nation, and you want to get involved and help. I hope that's where you are, because that's where I am. Okay. So I want to tell you about a couple ways you can get involved in the next couple slides. So Traffic Jam is a student-led organization that was actually started in the Bibb County area, so the Macon, Georgia area, to help bring awareness to and decrease the incidence and prevalence of human sex trafficking. So this is such an important issue currently going on. And if you're in this area or familiar with this area, you definitely can join in with this Traffic Jam, which is again the name of it, this amazing organization that's helping to combat and bring awareness to these issues. There's also the organization known as Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia. You can also take it upon yourself to advocate to your local, state, and or nationally elected officials. Now, this is amazing because, again, with the prevalence being truly worldwide, nationwide, statewide, and community-wide, this is so amazing to be able to really contact your local and state elected officials to be able to advocate for this current issue. In addition, you can encourage local schools and school districts to develop and implement prevention protocols, right? Bringing awareness to the students, educating the students, and developing prevention protocols, because again, that primary window is individuals less than 16, as well as as we saw earlier, the main stat is individuals 13 to 14 years old. Healthcare providers can also become increasingly more educated on the signs and symptoms that can present to be able to, again, bring awareness in their practice. And journalists can also help to educate and bring awareness through their work as well. So if you were to be out in the community, grocery shopping or any kind of shopping, you're in the community, you're at the movie theater, anywhere you are, in your place of work, in your place of worship, if you see something suspicious, say something. So if you see something, say something. So if you're suspecting human trafficking, you can call these various or text these various numbers. So you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline as the number listed here. The Georgia Trafficking Hotline is also listed here. And then you can also text Be Free to 233-733. So these are all great ways to be able to, again, if you see something, say something. Please save these numbers in your phone. That way, if you were to see something, you're not having to try and come back to this PowerPoint presentation to find it. You're able to go right to your contacts and text or call these numbers to be able to hopefully save a life.
And we'll be speaking with you today about the culture of recovery that we have instituted here within our health system, and our maternal peer support program and how we got started and what all it entails. We do have objectives. We want you to be able to discuss neonatal abstinence syndrome and what that is, and learn about the chemical changes that occur within the brain with substance use disorder, and be able to describe the elements of initiating culture of recovery. So how it all began. It really began with a passionate bedside nurse, a neonatal nurse practitioner, and a neonatal physical therapist. And these passionate bedside people really, we had a high population of infants with neonatal abstinence syndrome, or we all call it NAS. And we realized our length of stay was really long. It was about 37 days. And so we implemented standardized education, standardized caregiving, standardized medication weaning. And we got our length of stay down to about 21 days for these infants. However, we realized there's a missing piece. There's a missing aspect of what can we do more? We're not doing enough for our moms. We're not doing enough for our families, for infants that have neonatal abstinence syndrome. So long story short is that we, leadership removed barriers. We supported our bedside staff. I was actually bedside staff when all of this started, to really get things going. So what is neonatal abstinence syndrome? It is a diagnosis that is the result of maternal substance intake while the infant is still in utero. And that's whether those, it's whether those substances are listed or prescribed. And so neonatal abstinence syndrome, it's looked as a bad disease for these infants. However, it's not necessarily bad, because if a mom is in recovery and on medication-assisted treatment, neonatal abstinence syndrome is an expected outcome. So we might have a mom in recovery, however, her infant is still going to have NAS, and we needed to learn how to do better. We needed to learn how to support the moms better, how to have conversations with them. So that's really what neonatal abstinence syndrome is. And what do these infants look like? So they can have fevers, they can have breathing issues, they can be jittery and have very hard tremors, very tight muscle tone. They can have gut issues to where they are spitting up all the time. They can, or not being able to tolerate feeds. So there's a lot of just different disturbances with central and autonomic nervous systems when it comes to this disease. And however, what it is not is that it's not infants being born addicted, because infants are withdrawing from the substance when that umbilical cord is cut. Infants are born withdrawing from that substance. They're not born addicted to that substance, because addiction really entails drug use, tolerance, dependence, and a chemical imbalance with dopamine and endorphins. So infants don't have that capability. So they're withdrawing from that substance. So why do we care about this? Over the past decade, it has really become an issue within the medical world. The incidence of NAS has increased from 2.9 to 7.2 per 1,000 live births. And actually another study in 2018 saw that NAS was about 6.8 per 1,000 live births. And you can see down at the bottom that the ranges differentiate between, and are vastly different between the different states. And this is also could be, numbers are different for everyone and reporting is different for everyone. So in 2015, the state of Georgia started making NAS a mandated disease to report. And then in 2017, they changed a few questions. So, and we started looking at like ICD-10 codes and diagnosis codes for NAS. So it really just depends, like numbers. We know it's a problem. We know it has increased, and our awareness has also increased with this. So this is infants numbers of infants born with NAS. However, we do have maternal incidence as well. So what does that look like?
So for the maternal incidence, as you see here, in 2019, 6.6% of women reported prescription opioid use during pregnancy. And of that 6.6%, 21.2% reported misuse, meaning they did not get the prescription from a healthcare provider, or they were using it for reasons other than actually being in pain. 27.1% wanted or needed to cut down or stop using. But with that, almost 32% reported not seeking or not receiving counseling about what could happen to their baby at birth or what to expect, potential things or risks, anything, any kind of information throughout their pregnancy when it came time up until the time of birth. So the question is why? Why do individuals use substances? What's the reason behind it? With that, a lot of people start using because it's exciting or it's fun or it's socially accepted. And over time, if they continue to use, then things begin to plateau. It changes from doing it because it's fun to doing it because they need to do it. So there's changes in the brain, receptors. It gets into the discussion of like dopamine and how it affects them. But typically they start for fun and then it eventually switches over to it could be self-medication to feel better. It could be just thoughts of feeling better, basically just trying to function and maintain throughout everyday life. So there are different factors that play into the role or reason why people develop addiction. So we have environmental, which means that's focused on what their circumstances were possibly coming up, or whether substance use was socially accepted within the household, or what they witnessed coming up. And then we have the
Physiological.
Yes, the physiological, which is like how do they feel, what's going on within their brain, what are they thinking. I had my own struggles with anxiety and depression as part of my functioning, and that was part of my reasons for use, was trying to self-medicate what was going on within my brain. And then we also have the genetic. So this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone, but my own personal experience, my parents both experienced substance use and mental health challenges, and that plays a role. Myself, I experienced mental health challenges as well as SUD, or substance use disorder. My brother as well identifies as a person that experiences mental health challenges. So genetics can definitely play a role as to whether someone experiences the challenges or not. So then we move into discussing dopamine. So when people experience or are participating in things that bring them pleasure, dopamine, it also, like, it you receive dopamine when you're learning, when you're having fun. It's the reward central part of our brain. And it also plays a role in basic functions. It also has to do with our emotion, motor control, reward, and the executive functions of our brain. Lack of dopamine has been related to depression, addiction, as well as schizophrenia. When it comes to dopamine, it says large surges of dopamine teach the brain to seek drugs at the expense of other healthier goals and activities. So for someone who has had large surges of dopamine, it makes it challenging to find pleasure doing regular daily activities. There's an example, someone who runs marathons on a regular basis compared to someone who is running their first marathon, the amount of joy that they receive after completing their marathon is completely different. So the person who has ran multiple marathons, right? It's kind of like it's just another day in their book. They ran another one, they finished it, they've completed, they're good. Whereas someone who is running their first 5K marathon ever, when they complete, they are more than likely going to be completely overjoyed, like ready to do another one, so excited, so pumped, ready to continue training and find out where's the next 5K? When can I do this again? Just because, you receive all the reward and pleasure from completing the first time. So here we have these are charts showing the difference in the peaks of dopamine when experiencing either food or sex. So when someone eats food that they are really, really enjoying, they will go from baseline up to around 150 and slowly, kind of slowly decrease. I guess that would be determined how fast it's digesting and all that. But then we also see with sex, it's a little bit more pleasurable and gives you a little bit more dopamine because it goes from the baseline all the way up to 200 and then will slowly decrease over time. And this right here shows the effects of drugs on dopamine release. So we see here, obviously, amphetamine has the highest increase from the baseline up to 1,000, which is a lot. But then it pretty fast, it will decrease over time. It shows within 2 hours, it's already on its way over halfway back down to baseline. It also shows cocaine, how it will slowly increase up to about 350 and then slowly decrease back down to baseline. Nicotine has a very quick surge from baseline up to about 225 and then slowly back down. And then morphine is kind of close to like a plateau there. It goes up a little bit and then it slowly comes back down. So when it comes to substance use, typically individuals will start using because when they use that first time, it goes way up and they have this really high, and it feels really good. So they continue using over time. Well, as the highs go up, you see that they never get quite as much of the high as they did the first time that they used. And then they continue use and their lows continue to get lower. Over time, it eventually becomes where the individual is using to get back to baseline instead of above baseline. When we move from the beginning of this to the end of it, that's what makes the difference when you see changes in behaviors. You see individuals participate in things that they normally wouldn't participate in. And it could also, when it comes to pregnant and postpartum women, you see individuals who maybe started using because it was fun, and then it ends up where they're at the other end of it and they can't stop using because they need it in order to function pregnant or postpartum. it becomes a survival for them. It's no longer fun. It's something that they have to do to get by.
So now we've kind of touched base on the science, and we know recovery is possible. Now what? So we actually provided this education to our staff or within the hospital. And this is going back to that journey of looking at, we have to do more for these moms. We have to do more for their families. We have to have those open and honest communications. So we actually brought in Georgia Council for Recovery and some of their experts and said, hey, what do we do? Like, how do we speak with these moms? And we had to have a staff mind change. We had them speak to us about and created modules for all of our staff to take about looking at substance use disorder and looking at it as a disease with decreases in dopamine, using up endorphins, looking at dynorphins, all of the neurotransmitters, and looking at it as an actual disease instead of a moral failure. Moms are seeking substances because they're trying to get to that baseline. So that's how, really understanding okay, why are they leaving the NICU? Why are they leaving the babies at the hospital? And really understanding those chemical imbalances. And then we also did recovery language training. Instead of saying that relapses have happened, we say they've started using again. And we talk about seeking recovery instead of mom's getting clean. Mom's going into recovery. She's seeking recovery. And we had just a lot of speaking engagements and having open and honest communication. And with that open and honest communication and the differences of language recovery, we also looked at our care for these infants with NAS. And we looked at different scoring methods because our previous practice was to look at all the infant signs and symptoms, score them. If they scored at a certain level, we would give them medications. We would give them morphine, and then they would get that every 3 hours until we were able to wean them off, and then they would go home, which is what created more morphine doses, longer length of stay. Instead, with that culture of recovery and mindset change, we looked at eat, sleep, console. And really looking at, can that infant function like an infant? Can they eat? Can they sleep? And can they console? If they can't do anything, then we would maximize non-pharmacologic measures. Those non-pharmacologic measures were or are looking at swaddle bathing, looking at infant touch and massage, doing skin to skin with mom, soft soothing music. And then if that couldn't work, then we would give them one dose of medication to help them instead of starting them on a routine of that medication. And then we would reset and say, okay, within a few hours, once the onset of that medication happened, can they eat, can they sleep, and can they console? If not, we would look at other things. With that whole mindset change, we actually looked at a family partnership agreement. And that means that it's a form that the parents read through and they sign, and it looks at what their expectations are of us and what we should expect from them. And it basically goes into, we expect them to be open and honest with us. We expect clear communication. We expect them to be at the bedside. With our previous scoring method, be like, no, we got them to sleep. You're good. You can just go do whatever. But now we're like, nope, it's your baby. Come on in. We'll teach you how to comfort them. We'll teach you how to take care of them. This is yours. We're helping you. And then, but also what they expect from us is open and honest communication, clear communication. And that really, the whole mindset change, that culture of recovery, really encompasses families. When we implemented Eat, Sleep, Console, we did a research study on this, and we found that our total cost of stay actually decreased by about $3,000. And that really looks at, because when we were caring for these infants before, they were automatically admitted to the NICU. We automatically had mom-baby separation. However, if mom is in recovery or if infants not showing major signs and symptoms of withdrawal, they might stay with mom with that mother-infant dyad on mother-baby to keep them together, which decreases that length of stay, which decreases the cost of stay. Also, we looked at, when we implemented this, we decreased our number of morphine doses and morphine usage, only because instead of starting them on an around-the-clock every 3-hour schedule with morphine, we would only give it to them a one dose, only if they needed it. And really having that culture with providers as well, and that trust of saying, hey, this baby needs a dose of morphine and medication to get back to baseline. And so with this, we looked at maternal peer support. And when we said we need to do better, we can do better, we actually had a mom come into, like a mom that was in recovery, come into a meeting with us, and we'll see her a little bit later in a video, but she said, treat me like I'm a person. Don't treat me like I'm an addict. That's what I've done. It's not who I am as a person. And we're like, whoa, what is that? So we implemented maternal peer support, and we started small. We started only in our NICU. The peer recovery coaches would only see our moms with infants with NAS in the NICU. It included different trainings, cuddler training, HIPAA training, all kinds of other things. And then it grew to all of our women's and children's. And we're trying to grow a little bit more, looking at outpatient consults. And Demetria will speak to the process in just a few minutes. But with the maternal peer support program, they're a bridge to the community that we can't do as hospital personnel. So as hospital employees, we can take care of baby. We can teach them while they're here. However, the meetings with DFACs, the family treatment court involvement, or any other instances where that mom requests that needs support outside of the hospital, we can't give it to her. So they are that bridge to the community to help support mom, help support recovery. And even if mom's not seeking recovery at the time, they are still there to have those conversations because they're women in long-term recovery. So I'm going to show this video to show how we started the program and what that looks like.
Pregnant with Briar, used the whole time.
Let's try that again.
The Peer Recovery Coach program is designed to help moms who are struggling from a substance abuse disorder. Their babies come to the NICU having symptoms of withdrawal from those substance abuse. We have a peer recovery coach who's specially trained, who will meet with mom, discuss concerns that she may have, and also help her with resources that she may not have known existed to help her in recovery.
I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I struggled with opiates for a long time. And when I found recovery, I thought, wow, how do people not know that this is an option? And my life turned around drastically as a result of my recovery, and I wanted that for other people. I wanted to be the hope that other people saw, because I could do that. I could be that help, that hope for someone else.
I started using when I was 19. When I met my husband, Joey, we were using pain pills, and every once in a while we were doing heroin through IV use. I got pregnant with Briar, used the whole time I was pregnant with her. The day after I got out of jail, I was supposed to come down here and see her with my husband. Dropped my mother-in-law off here to see her, and I went and got high. Came back, and the hospital refused to let me inside because they knew I had gone and got high. 2 days later, Briar was supposed to be released from the hospital. So she was released to my mother-in-law. Got pregnant a little while after with Patrick. Tried to commit suicide while pregnant with him. My drug addiction was real heavy. Finally, Evita heard about me and took me in. And that's when I decided that I was going to do things differently with Patrick.
That was really great to see how she saw we were always looking out for her baby first. but we taught her, and we taught her well, so that it was a faster process, and she felt more in control, and that was good.
And people who are going through pain, they tend to see nothing but their own pain, and it's hard to separate that, and it's hard for them to think about what the child needs. So to get on that personal level and actually really build a rapport with them is important and vital to getting them help.
And they don't treat these moms as if they have done something wrong. They treat them as people with a disease. And that is a beautiful thing, because there's no shortage of guilt and shame for us. We do that all on our own. We don't need someone to tell us how bad we are, because we know. I'm just really grateful for the leaders that paved the way and did the footwork to make this program available, not just for my position as a person who works in the program, but for the peers in need. And hopefully this is just the beginning.
So now that we see and have heard about what that peer support program is and how they support moms, and Brandy Wine was actually our first mom that we sat down and had a conversation with, and she was open and honest with us because she had 2 infants with us, one while she was actively using and one while she was in recovery. So that's kind of the pivotal moment that helped change our mindset to work with moms and work with recovery and work with our peer recovery coaches. So now Demetria is actually going to talk about our maternal peer support program, what it entails, and who are our peer recovery coaches and what training they go through. So a peer support is someone who uses lived experience to support someone experiencing something similar. Again, my name is Demetria Bowles. I am the Maternal Peer Support Program Manager. More importantly, I am a woman and mother in long-term recovery. For me, it has been 5.5 years since I felt the need to use substances in order to survive. So my lived experience, I've experienced having children while using substances, seeking recovery. I've had a child in recovery. I've had children in the NICU. So every day working with the Georgia Council for Recovery, partnered with Northeast Georgia Medical Center, I get to use that lived experience with the peers who come into the hospital to deliver. Not just myself, but the other coaches that are coming in as well use the lived experience. We go through an extensive training while working with the Georgia Council for Recovery. It is called the CARES training. This is a 40-hour course that focuses on peer support for addictive disease. They highlight their values within the training, which includes integrity, hope, wellness, diversity, and of course, recovery. They'll go through this extensive training, and the training itself will pull on heartstrings, but it also teaches you how to be a professional within the community while using your lived experience in supporting peers. And it's quite a beautiful thing to witness. And it's a great way to, I guess, incorporate peers within the community as the connection, as the liaison, when someone's coming in and experiencing things and not sure, where do I go? What do I do? What's next? The peer support is able to go in and say, or actually do motivational interviewing and figure out, what direction is this peer going? Are they seeking treatment? Are they even seeking recovery right now? What does recovery look like for them? Do they want to join a program? Are they going to be working with DFACs? How do they best see that working out? What support can we offer them in order to be successful in whichever direction they're going? So typically the way that happens is hospital staff will identify a mother, and they will reach out to peer recovery
peer recovery will come into the hospital and have an initial encounter with mom. While in the room, if there's support persons that's present in the room, we'll ask permission to speak, and we will go into explaining who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do. And then when mom is discharged, we will continue to follow up with her while she's out in the community as the liaison or the connector to the supports that she's seeking or has identified needing. We will work with moms navigating DFACs if they are involved. We will connect moms with donations that we've received, whether it's diapers, bottles. So we even have the safe sleep where we can go over to safe sleep with them and provide them with a pack and play, different things based on different needs. And then we, of course, continue to provide the ongoing support for as long as they want us around. To date, we went live October 2018 inside the hospital system, and to date, we have had over 1,140 initial encounters. So that's 1,140 different women that we have come in contact with. And over the almost 6-year period, we have had 9,920 follow-ups within the moms within the communities. Everyone's story looks different. Our hope is to support them to success. And with that, we have a few success stories that we'd like to highlight. I have one peer who I met here at the hospital back in, I believe I met her in June 2021. She delivered sometime December 2022. Since delivering, when she delivered, she was in recovery. She was doing medicated assisted recovery, had a successful birth. Baby is healthy, doing well. And since leaving the hospital, she herself has gone out and she attended the CARES Academy, and she is now certified as a CPS, addictive disease, and is now seeking employment within a local recovery community organization. I have another peer. We met her when she was coming in to deliver. When she left the hospital, she went into residential treatment. She joined family treatment court. She successfully completed family treatment court, and then she started working with us at the Georgia Council for Recovery and became a maternal peer support coach. She is also CARES and CPS addictive disease certified. And then I have one more who is another peer we met. She came through another program of ours who does some of the similar provide some of the similar support services. She completed that program. She joined FTC, went through residential, successfully completed both. She is actually an alcohol use disorder coach with the Georgia Council for Recovery and is currently working on getting her CARES and CPS AD certification. So that's a few of the many successes that we've had working with these moms within the hospital system. And not just with like peer recovery coaches, and it's had an initial, like the impact that it's had on hospital staff as well. When we first said, hey, we're going to have peer recovery coaches, this is who they are, this is what they're going to be doing, we would have staff go, no, I'm good. They don't need to come into this room. They don't need to be part of the care. Versus now with that culture and that change and mindset change, they see the good that can happen and the good that can come of it. And now we have those same staff going, I don't think this mom has a peer recovery coach. Do you want to call or do you want me to call? And having those conversations. And we've had and it's because as nurses, it's in our blood to take care of our patients and their babies. And so we are very protective of our babies. We're very protective of our patients. And with that mindset change of what is substance use disorder, because substance use disorder affects us all in different ways, whether it's a loved one, whether it's a best friend, whether it's a significant other,
whether it's parents and your parents and were born into it. Substance use disorder affects us in every single way. And that mindset change and that culture has to change in order to provide the best care that we can for our patients. And that's where the success stories really come in, is just going, no, even Demetria, when she delivered with us, we changed our practices and our policies based off of her feedback and her experiences. If a mom is in long-term recovery, we drug test every mom, but that baby's not going to get a drug screen. Versus before Demetria delivered, even if mom had a history and she was in recovery, that infant might still get a drug screen. So really taking that feedback and listening and how we can do better, that's some of our success stories too, and impacts. And actually a research study was done between Northeast Georgia and Georgia Council for Recovery, and we found that among birth parents with substance use disorder and their newborns, we found that if a peer recovery coach is involved with that mom and that dyad, with the family as well, we did really reduce average length of stay by about 2.2 days within the hospital for those infants. And I think that's really a tale of looking at moms and having the discussion and keeping mom and baby together versus being automatic NICU admissions for infants with NAS. And so what are our next steps with this culture of recovery and with our maternal peer support program? Is we're actually looking to expand it into our OB offices. And that's taking a lot of work on our end to work with our IT and work with our electronic health record system, because we're electronic health, like in this day and time, everything's electronic. So really paper referral forms or fax forms are not what our providers want, just being honest, open and honest. And so we're actually looking to build a platform within our electronic health record so that peer recovery coaches can log in, get a consult list, and be able to speak with moms and contact moms based off of that referral list.
And getting to them earlier.
So they're not coming into the hospital to deliver and being like, hey, here's your peer recovery coach, and introducing them first. It's having those conversations in those that, are you seeking recovery? And having those initial conversations when they're 12 weeks pregnant, 16 weeks pregnant, versus coming in to deliver and starting those conversations. And then also we work with other organizations that want to implement the maternal peer support or want to look at implementing Eat, Sleep, Console and that education and what it looks like. So we have a few grants that we work with outside of the community and help other organizations to start what we started. And then our last slide of people support what they help to create. So coming back full circle, this started with bedside staff and hospital staff saying, we have to do better. We can do better. What do we need to do? And who do we need to get in here to do this? And then that started the beautiful relationship that we have with our maternal peer support program throughout all women's and children's, and now going into our OB offices as well. So here's our contact information for hospital questions, Eat, Sleep, Console questions. You can reach out to me at aubrey.williams@nghs.com. And then Demetria.
For maternal peer support questions, for recovery community organizations, anything on that side of things, you can reach out to me at demetria@gc4recovery.org, or you can reach out via the Georgia Council for Recovery website.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker for the 2024 Georgia Wellness Summit, Dr. Sonu. Dr. Sonu obtained his medical degree at the Medical College of Georgia and completed his residency in combined internal medicine and pediatrics at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, Illinois. Following his residency, he pursued a fellowship at the Cook County Preventive Medicine and Public Health Program and earned his Master of Public Health at Northwestern University. Currently, Dr. Sonu serves as a medical director at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. In this role, he provides programmatic support for Strong for Life, as well as the Atlanta Legal Aid and the Health Law Partnership, HELP, a medical legal collaborative between Children's and Georgia State University. Dr. Sonu is also an assistant professor of internal medicine and pediatrics at the Emory University School of Medicine. His expertise and research interests are focused on the prevention of adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care education. We are incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Sonu with us today to share his insights and expertise. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stan Sonu.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be here and have this opportunity to present at the 2024 Georgia Commission on Women Wellness Summit. My name is Stan Sonu, and I am an academic physician by way of Emory University School of Medicine, Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and Grady Memorial Hospital. As mentioned in my bio, I have had a long-standing interest in the connection between childhood adversity and all sorts of different health outcomes. And as my work in this space has evolved over time, I would say my perspective has really been broadened to topics beyond childhood adversity, to thinking about bigger questions related to living well and the idea of flourishing. What are the inputs of flourishing? What do we know from the research about human flourishing? So, in light of the theme of our conference, which is health in action, I am delighted to be able to share with you some thoughts that can help us not only in the work that we do for others, but for our own lives as well. Now, when I first learned about trauma, this whole topic in 2015, it absolutely changed the trajectory of my career, but more importantly, it made a tremendous impact on my own life and in my closest relationships. Really, as I learned to understand and make sense of my own story. So my hope is that as we move together through this topic today, that something will resonate with you, that will be that nudge, perhaps, that you've needed to think about and pursue your own healing and journey of self-discovery. Now, as I mentioned, the theme of today's conference is health in action. And certainly through this presentation, there are going to be many thoughts you'll have with respect to action steps. I hope that that's what happens. But before we rush to creating a kind of checklist of task or action plan, my ask of us is really just to be present. If your schedule is anything like mine, you are constantly moving from one thing to the next, and it can be pretty hard. It can be pretty difficult to find time for rest and contemplation. I hope this hour can provide that space for you. So for the time that we have, my request for us, my humble request is for us to just be. This is a time, think about it as a way to check our own emotional and mental vital signs. The truth is, to do the work of caring and serving our patients, our clients, our families, it really doesn't require more than who we are. And the thing about it is, what gets in the way a lot of times of being able to show up as we are and meet people where they are the layers of stress that we're dealing with, coping, self-protection, the ways that we numb out, or the ways that we just crawl by or get by, that we get so used to that after a while it feels like there's no other way to be. While I'm going to be sharing about how adversity shows up in children, adolescents, and adults this morning or today, this talk was equally relevant to us as it is anybody we provide care for or provide services for. So everything about adversity and flourishing is as much about our lives as it applies to the people we serve. So in this talk, I have three primary objectives. One, let's unpack the problem, get on the same page about what we know from the research on trauma and health. I know that trauma is an increasingly popular topic in popular media. You've probably seen reels on TikTok or Instagram from various, social media therapists and whatnot talking about trauma. A lot of that information is great, but a lot of it, as it sort of drifted from, into the outer valences, and it's far from the nucleus of source of information, a lot of that information can kind of be misleading. Not every experience that we go through, for example, is traumatic. Some are uncomfortable, some are distressing, but not every experience reaches that criteria or threshold of true trauma. The second thing we'll talk about is what's happening in our bodies. Let's talk a little bit more about the physiology or the physiologic changes in response to these experiences or exposures to trauma. And I think that's interesting because that really solidifies the fact that this connection between trauma and our health is real. It's not a fad, and it's not going to go away. We can't just turn a blind eye to it and expect that we'll talk about something else in the next 5 years. What we've learned about trauma is here to stay. In this second point, we'll talk about that. And then third, we'll dive into some aspects on what we can do in response to what we've learned from the research on trauma, from traumatology or trauma science research. And in that section, I will highlight one framework that I think is really useful called trauma-informed care. You might have heard about it in other presentations, but my take on trauma-informed care is really informed by how we care for patients at the bedside. And so I'm hoping that something there will connect with you as well. So let's jump in and talk a little bit more about the problem. What is this connection? What have we learned about trauma and health? Well, let me start with a quote that I have a dad joke. I cannot resist saying this dad joke, so I have to say it this time. It was said by Dr. Bob Ross, not the painter, but the pediatrician. Okay, now that I got it out of the way, the quote is, some years ago, Dr. Ross said, as he was leading this large endowment in California, the California Endowment, he observed that of all public health issues that are important for him, especially from where he sat, that childhood trauma is the number one public health crisis. But not only that, it's a public health crisis that is often hidden in plain sight. And I love this quote because it captures the most insidious aspect of trauma, that it's a problem that is hidden in plain sight. And when it does show up, it often comes out as behavioral reactivity or dysregulation, which we in the public often label as, oh, that person is just, a person of bad character, or what's up with them? What's wrong with them? When a lot of times what we're missing is what's happening underneath the behavior that is creating the pressure for that person to react in this way. When you start to understand the narrative of trauma from a bird's eye point of view as well, you start to appreciate how much our society has actually normalized trauma and to this day continues to fail to meet people where they are. And so bit by bit, I'm hoping that as we get more informed about trauma and how it shows up, how common it is, how normalized our society has made it, that we can discern better and respond more compassionately with greater empathy and kind when we notice that someone is having a trauma response or dysregulated. I want to anchor this talk with a patient case that might be relevant for this audience. So I'll just dive into it. We have a patient, and this is I would say a real life collection of patients in one person, but each of these components are real life examples. So I've called this patient Ava. She's 12 years old. She's at my clinic for a checkup. She's with her mother. She was formerly a straight A student and loved to swim, but over the past 3 or 4 years has struggled in school, has gotten into fights, has been suspended a few times. And as time has gone on, she's been increasingly withdrawn from her mother. She has these really drastic mood swings. She's always on her phone, social media. She's staying out late. Her mom feels increasingly disconnected from her, and she doesn't know what to do. Her mother is now concerned about ADHD, which was never a concern prior to 4 years ago. And her mother also suspects that Ava started dating an older teenager, but isn't sure because Ava really isn't talking about it at this point. Now, let's pause there. We're going to come back to this case in a little bit. I do want to tell you a different story that is, I think, a really good primer for why this topic of trauma and health is such a paradigm shifting concept. So I call this story Smoke or Fire. If you come back with me to the mid 1980s, and this is when I was born, 40 years ago, my goodness, we're in San Diego, California at a Kaiser Permanente. And at the time, at Kaiser Permanente, there was a physician by the name of Vince Felitti who was in charge of running a weight loss clinic that was actually really successful. Men and women would come in, they would lose weight, and they were able to keep it off as long as they stayed in this program. So what he noticed, though, despite the program's effectiveness, was that over a period of 5 years, about half the people just left the program. And what made him even more confused was that the people who left the program were more likely to have lost a substantial amount of weight or have reached their goal weight when they left. Why would people leave a program if it was delivering on what it was set out to do, what its intention was? So being the very curious person that he still is today, he conducted a series of interviews with as many former participants as he could find. And it just happened to be that through one woman's story, he stumbled upon something that was completely unexpected, something that he didn't learn about in medical school. Neither did I, by the way, but something that radically changed his perspective on what was happening, what could explain the obesity, the prevalence of obesity that he had been observing. So while in the program, this woman he interviewed went from being over 400 pounds and got down to about 130 in less than 2 years. And when she achieved this weight of about 130, suddenly she disappeared. And several weeks later, she comes back having regained almost 40 pounds. And when he interviewed her, she shared that a coworker, an older gentleman, had made a sexual proposition to her. He had hit on her. And this unexpected solicitation triggered for this person these long buried memories of when she had repeatedly experienced sexual abuse and trauma between the ages of 8 and 12. It was during this period of abuse at this age, at this young age, that she began this pattern of binge eating. What she noticed, later on, what she reflected is that the binge eating actually helped her to feel better. It was a kind of self-soothing activity. But what she noticed, what happened subconsciously, which she only could notice years later, was that eating and gaining weight became a way to protect herself and go unnoticed, fly under the radar from other potential predators. Dr. Felitti had never heard anybody talk about weight gain or binge eating in this way before, as it was a kind of protective mechanism. So he went back to his team and he instructed them to ask everyone they could about their histories in childhood, especially if there was a history of sexual trauma. And what they went on to discover was that almost 60% of the people in the program who had quit had a similar history of abuse, and that sexual trauma was disproportionately more common relative to the general public and relative to those who remained in the program. So the key lesson for Dr. Filiti and his team, the kind of aha moment, or the thing that allowed them to see the forest for the trees, to have that perspective that was missing, was that what we often label in healthcare as the problem, which in this case is obesity, was in fact the solution or signal for his patients or the people he was caring for. The problem, which we call, or the thing that we call a problem, in this case, was a defense mechanism, an adaptive survival skill, but one, of course, that comes with serious health consequences. And we can replace the problem. It extends beyond just obesity. We can also replace that with substance use disorders or other types of health risk behaviors or risky health behaviors that often in healthcare, we're like, if you just quit this, then your life could be better in so many other ways. Why can't you just quit this? And as it turns out, a lot of these behaviors or activities we label as problems, there's more to the story than we can realize. As it turns out, as we'll see shortly, maladaptive behavior is a very common phenomenon in how we individually deal with the consequences of adversity and trauma. And in this small scale study is what inspired and led to the development of the landmark Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which I'll talk about shortly. But the reason I call this story Smoke or Fire was from this quote by Dr. Filiti. He said that obesity, though an obvious physical sign, was not the core problem to be treated, any more than smoke is the core problem to be treated in house fires. So my thought-provoking question, you could say, as we go into the rest of this talk is, in the work that we do, in the work that you do, what do we want to be doing? Do we want to be putting out smoke, or do we actually want to be putting out fires? Now, one person, after I said this, some years ago, asked me, well, doc, smoke inhalation is not good for us either, right? And I was like, touche. So in some ways, we have to be addressing both. But I think my point stands that if all we do is try to wave around the smoke, try to clear out the smoke from a house fire, but never actually get to the fire, we're going to be putting out smoke for forever. And so I think we do need to turn our attention more upstream, thinking about how can we actually prevent these fires from developing in the first place, and how can we effectively put them out. So as I mentioned, that small study that Dr. Filiti did from his weight loss program inspired what we call the ACE study today. Now, this is a landmark public health study that has revolutionized our enthusiasm in studying trauma. It's been cited over 12,000 times in popular media, I think over 6,000 times in academic literature. This is not a new study. It was published in 1998, and so participants were recruited in the mid-90s. It lasted formally for about 10 years, but it's still ongoing today, at least through Kaiser Permanente. They are still collecting data on their patients. And as you can see there, it was a joint effort by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. Now, what these researchers did was they asked over 17,000 adults who were all participants in the Kaiser Permanente San Diego location, and they asked these adults about 10 different categories of adversities experienced specifically within the home. And these adversities, you can see there on the screen, spanned 3 domains of abuse, neglect, and household stress. Now, of these 17,000 adults, 75% were mostly white, 75% had attended college, and 100% were insured. And so altogether, this participant sample was quite affluent with respect to other research samples in that day and in present day as well. A lot of people said that, this is actually a weakness of the study because it didn't include the broad diversity of people that that exist in the general public. But for me, I would say, well, hold on a second. I think it could actually still, there's some strengths to this design, even though the researchers didn't intend to make this point. Why could it be a strength? Well, it's because of what they found, that ultimately the ACE study showed that adversity in the home is way more common than we realized, even for people for whom society might assume are just doing fine. The story of adversity, turns out, is not something that anybody should or can feasibly create distance from. In many ways, it's our story just as much as it is the people we serve and care for. Now, as I mentioned before, the ACE study ran formally for about 10 years in partnership between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and it generated several dozens of research papers. I think 80 to 90 was the last count I had. Of these 90 papers, I want to condense what they found into 3 key findings. The first one, and we cannot skip over this, we cannot diminish the importance of how groundbreaking this finding was simply that ACEs are common and they cluster together. How common? Well, again, in this mostly white, mostly middle class and college educated and insured group, 64%, almost 2 out of every 3rd person, had 1 or more ACEs. So they just simply quantified the number of ACEs each person had. And so trauma from these data is not just a problem that we can attribute, like society tends to do, as something of those people, however you want to define that. We know from this study and several others since then that ACEs actually occur across every race, ethnicity, income level, community, geography. Now, with respect to patients at Grady, where I work clinically, collectively, there is a very, very high prevalence of trauma. Some years ago, they did a different kind of ACE study. It wasn't exactly the same as the original one, but what they found, they asked about a fewer number of ACEs, and they still found that the prevalence of people having 1 ACE or more was almost 90%. And then looking at Georgia more broadly compared to national data, we've learned in recent years that while the overall prevalence of Georgians having 1 or more ACE, which is represented in the blue there to the right, or the purple to the right, while it's similar to the ACE study at around 60%, I'm sorry, the blue, all the colored slices there represent 1 ACEs or more, and the gray represents 0 ACEs. While the prevalence of 1 ACE or more in Georgia is similar to the ACE study at around 60%, the prevalence of having 4 or more ACEs actually might be higher in Georgia, where it's 18% versus 12.5 or 16% in more recent data. So ACEs are common and they cluster together. I'll mention real quick the clustering piece. If a person had 1 ACE, they were about 90% likely to have 2 ACEs or more, and about 60% likely to have 3 ACEs or more. So it was actually less common that a person would just have 1 ACE and that's it. If a person had 1 ACE, they were very highly likely to have another ACE or more. The second key finding, and this is what just had my jaw on the ground the first time I heard about it. I remember being cynical. I remember being in disbelief. How do you know? And so I read as much as I could about ACEs. And after doing lots of reading on the ACE study and other related studies, I am completely convinced that this association is real. It's been replicated many, many times. And it's really telling a story that we have to pay attention to. And the point is that ACEs are associated with a multitude of undesirable health, behavioral, and social outcomes. What are some of these outcomes? Well, we know through the 10 years of the ACE study and other research related that ACEs increase the risk for things like health risk behaviors, which include behaviors like smoking cigarettes, early initiation of smoking in early adolescence, alcohol use disorder or alcoholism. This also includes early initiation of alcohol in early adolescence. ACEs also increase the risk of other types of drug use, especially IV drug use and opioids. and high-risk sexual behavior and teen pregnancy. Additionally, ACEs increase the risk of mental health problems from childhood through older adulthood, which include the most common ones like depression, anxiety, and PTSD, but also suicidality and hallucinations. I would also add here schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc. ACEs also increase the risk of chronic disease, and this is one of the areas that I was most cynical about. What they're saying here is that things that we experience in childhood can actually have an implication on our health in middle adulthood. And these associations have been borne out and replicated and repeatedly observed over and over again, not just within the ACE study series, but other research designs and other samples as well. The chronic diseases that have been most attributed or most highly associated with ACEs include things like cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, or other sort of valvular heart diseases and heart complications. COPD or chronic lung disease is also very common. Cancer, non-skin types of cancer, to be more specific, diabetes, obesity, sexually transmitted infections, autoimmune disease, and liver disease. And then finally, they also recognize that it's not just these traditional health domains that are implicated with ACEs, but there are other more socially relevant outcomes that are also disrupted or related to ACEs in a negative way. So we've learned that ACEs are linked with people's own perception of their health, poor self-reported health. They're associated with disability, mortality, unemployment, and financial stress. And while I've talked through a lot of outcomes here, I would stress again that these are just a sampling of the outcomes we know about. This is a table that I'm not showing with the intention that you would read every line. I just wanted to give you a sense of the breadth of outcomes that have been found to be associated with ACEs. Most, if not all, of these associations have what we call a dose-dependent relationship, meaning the more ACEs a person has, the higher risk of a given outcome. And so you can see here that it's not just one particular type of disease that is represented, but really ACEs are impacting us holistically in a global sense. This is a slide, this table is just showing adults. Over here, the next slide is some similar, or there's some overlap in these outcomes, but specific to children in pediatrics. So these are not just outcomes that skip over childhood and manifest in adulthood, but we can actually observe the effect of ACEs actually going back to the earliest of childhood outcomes and developmental milestones. So in this study here, we can see that ACEs are associated with developmental delay, and this is developmental delay in general, which includes things like language and speech, social milestones, social interactions, gross motor skills, fine motor skills, sensory processing. And this is to the extent that for those young children who have had 7 or more ACEs, almost 100% of them were found and observed to have some kind of developmental delay. ACEs increase the risk for academic vulnerability. And this study found that after adjusting for which school the child is attending, their grade level, their race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, or even after adjusting for whether they were in special education, children with 4 ACEs were at a much higher risk for things like academic failure, having attendance problems, and having behavioral problems in general in the school. So what we see from this study is that ACEs don't just impact a child's academic potential, but it also affects their ability to stay regulated in school. And interestingly, it also affects their attendance, the regularity by which they attend school. Another school-based study found that those children with 4 or more ACEs are at a whopping 33 times greater risk for having some kind of learning or behavioral problem like ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. And this is compared to children who have no ACEs. Now, while the original ACE study only included ACEs that occur in the home, within the four walls of a home, things like abuse, neglect, and household stressors, we also have to acknowledge that there are many more types of adversities and traumas that are important and occur outside the home. And so I like to use this tree, which we call the tree of ACEs, to illustrate this point. Here, the leaves and the branches of the tree represent the 10 conventional ACEs that we just talked about. And you can see those are abuse, neglect, and different household stressors. Again, these are the ones that occur in the home. Now, every tree grows out of a trunk with many roots. And so here, the roots are what we call adverse community environments. These include things like poverty, violence in the community, racism, discrimination, economic disadvantage. In and of themselves, all of these are adverse events. They're also independently linked with poor health outcomes, but they also provide a kind of context or pressure out of which those leaves and branches, those interpersonal ACEs, occur at a higher frequency or a higher severity, or in the absence of a helpful resource. And this is a phrase that I borrowed from Laura Porter, who is a thought leader in this topic of ACEs. She said once that poverty is like pouring gasoline on the fire of ACEs. To go one step further, the health of the tree that grows out of the roots depends a lot on the quality of the soil, what kind of minerals and nutrients exist in the surrounding soil. And so we refer to the soil as adverse collective historical events. These are examples that I've included in recent history that have conferred an inter or multi-generational impact. These are things like slavery, genocide, mass incarceration, Jim Crow, the Holocaust, forced displacement, COVID, what's happening, the war in Ukraine, the war in Palestine right now. These are studies that have shown, there are several studies that have shown that trauma can actually be inherited across generations, and we can measure this through changes in a component of our cells called the epigenome. So I won't go into that today, but the main thing I want to stress here is that when we talk about ACEs, we can't really separate the conversation about ACEs apart from injustice and inequity. For me, it's really important that we maintain that link together, because if we only look at the surface level problems without understanding the history behind it or underneath it, we're really missing opportunities for understanding, but more importantly, we're missing opportunities to actually correct course and achieve equity in a way that humanizes people and is collaborative and supportive and like I said, understanding overall. Now, I know one of the pillars of the Georgia Commission on Women is human trafficking, so I wanted to include some information related to this topic specifically as it relates to ACEs. So there is one paper that I found from the American Journal of Public Health that asked this question: what is the relationship between ACEs and human trafficking, specifically within minors in Florida? And what they found, perhaps to no one's surprise on this call, was that there is a substantial relationship between ACEs and being a survivor or victim of human trafficking. Sexual abuse is by far the strongest predictor of human trafficking. But you can see there's actually quite a strong difference between gender. Girls are 2.5 times at greater risk for human trafficking with a history of sexual abuse, but boys are over 8 times greater risk. Additional relevant ACEs that increase the risk of human trafficking, being a victim of human trafficking within girls, it's emotional and physical neglect, a history of family violence. And for boys, interestingly, the signal that came up was emotional abuse. This is a study that shows in graphic form, again, with the sample of juveniles who were involved in the juvenile court system. And you can see here in the orange, the prevalence of ACEs in these juvenile these young people who are in the juvenile system. And in the blue are the prevalence of ACEs in the original Kaiser Permanente cohort. And you can see it's almost opposite, where if you look in that 4 or more category, as I showed earlier, about 12.5% of these adults in the Kaiser Permanente study had 4 or more ACEs. Look at the difference in the juvenile offender group, that almost, it looks like 50% of them had 4 or more ACEs. Now, building on that, there's another study that found, and this is from the CDC, that among ACE study participants, those with higher ACE scores were at higher risk for sexual re-victimization in adulthood. And there was a dose-dependent relationship between ACE score and re-victimization. So if we step back for a second and just try to digest what we've been through, I hope what becomes clear is that this experience of trauma for a lot of people is not just an experience or like just a part of their past, but on the contrary, the experience of trauma, of unmitigated adversity, can be utterly devastating across multiple domains of well-being and functioning in our society. I know we've heard a lot. Some years ago, there was this phrase, we have this school to prison pipeline, but I would argue that the problem is bigger and it starts earlier and it has a historical precedent. What we're not seeing is merely this school to prison pipeline. What we're seeing actually is an unaddressed trauma to prison pipeline, and school is just a touch point along the way where we're recognizing there are problems. And as a society, if I can speak bluntly for a second, we've actually criminalized, we've opted to criminalize and jail and imprison victims of trauma that no child or teenager ever asked for in their life. So let's go back to Ava. We mentioned before, Ava is here for a checkup, and she was formerly this bright student, but in the past 4 years has been struggling. And so I hope after what we've sort of gone through, we're wondering, okay, why? Like, what's happening? What has happened in Ava's life that led to this change? I hope we're getting away from the idea that Ava just suddenly doesn't care about her future, or she only cares about her friends, or she wants to disrespect her mother. I hope we sort of can pick up on that sense that, oh, something actually happened in her life. Well, as we learn more, as we talk to her, we find out that about 5 years ago, when Ava was 7, her parents separated because her mother was being abused by the father, was being abused. There was intimate partner violence going on. And so, the father is no longer in contact with the family, including Ava. Mom has never talked to Ava about what happened with her father. After her father left, they just kind of stopped talking about it and buried it and tried to move on. Mother, she is working 2 full-time jobs, and she's struggling to make ends meet because of the separation, and they're at risk of moving again. And the mother expressed that she was really, really stressed about this. On top of that, the mom is dealing with her own health concerns. She has severe depression. Her anxiety has gotten worse. She's been drinking heavily at night and thinks that Ava doesn't know about it. She thinks she's been able to sort of keep that compartmentalized from Ava. Separately, when I talk to Ava, she reports regularly skipping school, vaping, drinking in cars with older teens, and she felt alive when she shoplifted for the first time the other week. She says in passing, really, Doc, the only good thing in my life right now is Ron. All right, we'll come back to her shortly again after we move through this next section. So we just spent a good chunk of time unpacking this association between trauma and health. Now I'd like to jump in, dig in a little bit more into asking the question, like, how is all of this happening? What is driving this relationship, this connection between adversity and all of these health outcomes? As it turns out, in the past 3 decades, with the advent of sophisticated brain imaging technology, with advances in research and child development, even sociology, anthropology, there's been this incredible convergence of research from multiple fields uh, again, from neuroscience, psychology, medicine, public health, child development, anthropology, all around understanding how stress and trauma affect our brains. Turns out the brain is the central component, it's the organ that is most impacted from unaddressed adversity or trauma. I love this quote from Doctors Perry and Ludi Dobson. They said that understanding the power of traumatic events to shape the brain helps us better determine what a child needs to heal. I think this quote is so spot on because if we want to promote healing, we have to understand how these experiences affect our brains and the way our brains function. So I want to just give us 4 fundamentals, things to know about developmental adversity and the brain. This is kind of a crash course in interpersonal neurobiology. The first, most important thing to know is that fundamentally, when we are born, we are ready for connection. You could say that we are neurobiologically wired for it. What do I mean by that? Well, if all we do after a baby is born is feed the baby, change the diaper, and then try to put them to sleep, that baby will not thrive. Babies need, in addition to their physical needs being met, they need emotional connection and relational connection consistently in a safe, stable, nurturing way over time. Why is that so important? Well, the research has shown that when babies are in that kind of environment, especially in the first 5 years of life, it is fertilizer, it is powerful fertilizer for optimal brain development. We do best when we are when we have strong relational connections with our caregivers and other consistent adults in our lives. The second thing we have to know is that while we can't change the genetics we're born with, experiences shape brain architecture. Positive experiences and negative experiences both influence brain architecture. And if we influence the way that the neurons form and how the brain architecture is sort of unfolded over time, it's going to impact circuitry and therefore function over the life course. Third, we don't like trauma at any age. At any age, it's not great. It's bad. But the earlier it occurs, the more cascading its effect, the more widely the development can be disrupted. You remember that slide that I showed earlier about developmental delay in adversity. So if we know that early life stress has the greatest impact on child development and well-being, this should push us to think about interventions that occur earlier in a child's life, or better yet, before a child is even born and a couple or a person is thinking about having children. Lastly, toxic stress. There's this idea of toxic stress, and that qualifier word toxic is really important because what it's saying is that not all stress is bad or equally bad, but there is a kind of stress environment that can reach toxic levels that is particularly devastating to healthy brain development. One way you can think about toxic stress is it's kind of a hijacked stress response system that doesn't respond to normal feedback mechanisms. What we learned about this thing called toxic stress is that it can disrupt healthy brain development. It can dysregulate our normal stress responses, which I'll talk about in a second. And in so doing, it can derail healthy socio-emotional development and show up in problematic or challenging behavior, which often represents a dysregulated state. One of the most important pearls that I want to leave you with in this section, and this is kind of like the elephant in the room, and this is one of the most important things I've learned from this research, but also one of the most difficult things to remember and implement in my daily practice. This is the key. The behaviors that stem from how a child survived or coped with adversity or trauma are actually normal or predictable events in the sense that they are adaptations. They are not inborn personality defects. Now, please don't get me wrong. This is not a plea to, excuse bad behavior or undesired or negative behavior, but it's a way for us to understand better what is happening when we see that child or client or parent who is dysregulated. Maybe you see it in public. Maybe you see it at the grocery line when someone has been waiting too long and they just start losing it. Or maybe you see it in traffic in the form of road rage. But understanding these dysregulated behaviors is so important because what it prevents us from doing is saying that person is just bad. Instead, we can reframe it and say, there's something that happened in that person where they're just beside themselves and not regulated right now, where we don't judge their character or person, but we think strategically or empathetically, how can I help this person reestablish regulation? Let's talk about stress for a second. How can we understand what's happening on a physiologic level in response to adversity? There's been a lot we've learned about trauma through understanding our brains and how our brains and bodies respond to stress. One heuristic or approach to this that I'm a big fan of is polyvagal theory, which organizes how all this works in a kind of digestible, accessible way. But my caveat to this is just one way of describing an incredibly complex phenomena of how our brains handle stress and adversity and trauma. So it's purposely simplified. So with that being said, before civilization, if you and I are still living as hunter-gatherers and we're in a clan, our bodies needed an efficient, fast-acting stress response to survive threats. So if we were out in the woods and we came across this animal, this bear, instantaneously, our bodies would need to be able to kick into high gear to survive this, let's say, mama bear who feels threatened that we're too close to her cubs. And so what happens in our bodies, well, actually starting with our brains first, is that once our brain recognizes, hey, this is a life-threatening event, it activates the smoke alarm center of our brain, which is called the amygdala. And the amygdala in turn sends downstream signals to activate our stress response system. Our stress response system is composed of two primary systems, the sympathetic nervous system and this thing we call the HPA axis, which stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is where this is sort of how cortisol, which is a stress hormone or stress steroid, becomes elevated in our bodies in response to stress. So as the stress response system is activated, and as it activates the sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis, it leads to the release of many endogenous stress molecules that our own body produces. And these molecules then act on our organs and change our body's physiology. And they promote things like an increased heart rate, they raise our blood pressure, they help our airways to dilate more, to increase the surface area, to better exchange oxygen and CO2. There's more oxygen delivery to muscles. On the flip side, blood is shunted away from our gut system because when you're trying to survive a life-threatening situation, it's not the time to have a bowel movement or need to stop and pee. But the point here is that in response to a perceived threat inside all of our bodies, these steps occur. But the output or the action of our stress response is variable. Some of us, as we're together, might think, I have a better chance if I fight this bear because I can't run away and survive. Others of us might think, there's no way I can fight and win. I got to run away. That's my best chance. There's a third response that is particularly common in children, especially if, let's separate our, the example from the bear for a second, but especially if the abuse is coming from in the home where they cannot fight the perpetrator and win and they cannot run away and survive. The third response is to stay put and freeze, where the brain dissociates. And in that dissociated response is actually an extremely intelligent protective mechanism that can actually help a person survive even these kind of life-threatening situations with a grizzly bear. Now, over time, the brain automatically takes inventory of which responses have worked and which haven't. And the ones that work can become crystallized into predictable behavioral responses that can emerge involuntarily underneath our awareness whenever the brain perceives threat. So, for example, if the fight response worked for the person when they were a child, let's say that they got really angry and it neutralized the threat, the brain is going to remember that and may bring that behavior out non-specifically in future situations when that individual, as a teenager or as an adult, feels threatened. What you might see is a sense of, in response to a stressful circumstance, in an interpersonal conflict, you might see hypervigilance emerge, rage, irritability. Another example, if fleeing or the flight response worked, you might see avoidance behavior or also anxiety, hyperactivity. And then if neither of those things worked, you might see the behaviors related to dissociation, depression, exhaustion, numbing, as reflected in the freeze response. Now, just keep in mind that this is a simplified portrayal of how the brain becomes reactive in response to trauma, because in reality, we have a blend of these responses depending on the context and what worked and what seems most likely to work in that moment. But again, what I want to stress here, what's important to remember is that these behaviors can be really problematic in public settings, but they're born out of a need for the individual to feel safe, to defend himself, to defend herself at the point of initial trauma or adversity. These are not personality features, but they are reactions that come out reflexively when an individual perceives a threat, whether it's physical or emotional. There's one more response I want to highlight here. It's called the fawn response. This is also a behavioral strategy that seems more common in modern day, in our modern society. It's where a child or adult can actually be a people pleaser to mitigate anticipated harm or distress. It's kind of like a combination of avoidance and dissociation. By being accommodating, which often can show up as like walking on eggshells, the individual can sort of safely avoid threat. And of course, this can be problematic in other social settings because it can appear as if a person is just like laid back, doesn't care, or maybe says one thing and does another. It can be really confusing, especially for health providers, because a patient may want to not disagree with me, but not feel comfortable with a treatment plan, and then go home and not do anything that we talked about and agreed about. So just another one I wanted to mention there. Now, real quick on toxic stress. I'm really summarizing decades of convergent research from multiple fields, but the bottom line with toxic stress is that ACEs can be a cause of toxic stress. This is the kind of stress that's so severe that it can disrupt brain development, brain function, and brain growth even. Toxic stress, again, is different from your day-to-day stressors like preparing for an exam or first day at a new job, or even more discrete ones like car accidents or if you had to spend the night in the hospital for some reason. Toxic stress is caused by a stressor or series of stressors that are prolonged, unpredictable, unrelenting, outside of that person's control, and the last piece is important, inherently in the absence of protective relational buffers. When toxic stress occurs during a child's development, which is most important and rapid in those first 5 years of life, that's when it can confer the most harm and most damage. And I showed this earlier, and I just want to reiterate the point that these behaviors that we often see, especially when we're interfacing with patients or clients in a very dire moment of need, these behaviors are not personality features, but they are behavioral reactions, again, that are coming out because they worked at some point in that person's past. The challenge for us, especially if you're in healthcare, is that inherently, when we meet people in the hospital or if they're coming in for a sick visit in the clinic, we're meeting them in a moment where their threshold for a behavioral response like this, reaction, their reactivity, that threshold is lowered. And so a lot of times we can kind of fall, if I'm just speaking for those of us in healthcare, maybe this can relate to anybody who's working with human beings really, but a lot of times we kind of slip into this mode where we think that our patients should be kind, that they should be regulated, that they should be able to deliver a history to us in a coherent manner, when we know that the truth is far from that. We have to recognize we are meeting people in a moment of need, of high stress. When they're coming to the hospital, that could be the worst week or worst day of their lives. And so in a sense, what I tell my teams on the wards is, hey, we actually have to expect some level of behavioral dysregulation, and we should actually be surprised by kindness, compassion, and regulation, because when we see that, that means that person is working really hard to make sure that they're on the same wavelength with us and communicating with us. But for the most part, let's let people be people and try to meet them where they are. Okay, I know I'm at the hour mark. If you got to go, I understand, but please hang with me if you're able to, because I did have another 15 minutes or so I wanted to spend to talk about this third section. How can we respond? What can we do with everything that we've just unpacked in the past hour or so? And I'm here to say really good news. Adversity is not destiny. I know we've talked about a lot of hard things, hard truths, but the reality is we actually have many reasons to have hope, because certainly ACEs and trauma are not the end of the story, and they're not the end of our stories. Here's the thing. We all know people, or we know that not everybody who's experienced trauma in their childhood is doomed to these negative consequences. We all know people in our lives. It might even be you who's watching this presentation at home who have made it despite the odds. Life is not perfect. It will never be, but our past experiences don't have to have power over us in the present. So what is it about people who are able to live that healthy, adjusted life despite having high numbers of ACEs? Well, what it all kind of boils down to, and what decades and decades of research have consistently found, is that the most important factor to promote healthy brain development, but also to recover from trauma long term, is for every person, every child, to have a safe, stable, nurturing relationship with an adult caregiver if you're a child, but with other peers, your family, close friends in adulthood. The answer is not medication alone or technology or some kind of fancy program. It is simply the committed presence of a loving and engaged person or adult. Again, if we're talking about a child, this is the game changer. We call these safe, stable, nurturing relationships. SSNRs, this is the irreplaceable starting point for every child. It's our best defense against a world that's full of uncertainty and trauma. Whereas adversity makes us vulnerable, healthy relationships actually protect us because they help protect the brain. And so every intervention that we do out of this should actually be grounded in this understanding of the importance, the critical importance, the centrality of supportive, nurturing relationships. This is the nucleus upon which everything else should be built around. Safe, stable, nurturing relationships help build this trait called resilience. And I want to pull this topic back, pull this concept back away from the corporate world where they just like tossed around resilience like it's just like, burn out this and resilient. Resilience is a very, very important and invaluable topic when it comes to trauma, because this is the trait that we want to see that is so protective that it can prevent future trauma, but can actually help a person navigate potentially traumatic experiences without succumbing and developing negative health outcomes. The two things that we have to know about resilience is that it's not something that anybody is born with or develops in isolation. Resilience is built, it's cultivated through the type and the quality and number of positive adult relationships or a child's social ecology. But in adulthood, it can also be strengthened or reinforced as well. But it makes no sense to tell a child, hey, be more resilient, as if that's a thing that a child can do by themselves. Resilience is, again, it's cultivated through that social ecology. And I mentioned before, resilience is important because when it's present, that means that even in the face of high ACEs or trauma, that person can still find ways to adapt in healthy ways and succeed. The reason resilience matters on a neuroscientific level is because resilience is that which can promote healthy neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the ability for the brain's architecture to change in response to a stimulus, whether that's an external stimulus or an internal stimulus. And as I mentioned earlier, just as negative experiences can alter our brain's architecture, so can positive ones. And so we just call these behaviors that we want to see in response to social connection, we just call that resilience. But please don't, please don't hear me wrong, that I'm not saying resilience is the only thing that matters. That, when we start to have that conversation, we can easily get into, well, what about the system? And what I'm here to say is that both need to be thought of, both need to be considered. But resilience as a trait in the trauma literature is extremely, extremely important. The hopeful thread that's been observed repeatedly in the research, in the resilience research, is that the weight of protective factors, which I'll show you a list in a second, far exceeds the weight of ACEs or trauma. It's like our brains and our bodies are predisposed not for sickness or illness, but we're predisposed to resilience because that's how much protective factors matter. Even in the face of adversity, research says that we know children can flourish if the family holds certain features or can develop certain features of resilience. So what are some examples of these critical factors that support building resilience? When the center here, like I mentioned, is safe, stable, nurturing relationships, but things like supporting parents and parental resilience is exceedingly important. The importance of being socially connected, and this is why things like screen time and isolation are so toxic to child development. We do better when we're more connected with others. Providing concrete support, housing, rental assistance, utility assistance, legal support. When a family needs that, when we provide it, that also promotes resilience. A big one is informing and educating parents on normal child development. A toddler cannot tell you what 2 + 2 is. They might in a few years, but that's a simple example, and I think most people can understand that. But a lot of times we think that a toddler should be able to regulate their tantrums, but that's not an age in which the brain has developed to the extent that it can do that in a healthy way. If we tell a toddler to suppress their tantrum or stop the behavior or fix it, what we're actually doing is telling them to suppress their emotional reality. So there are other ways that we can think about helping a child who's having a tantrum, but the more we know about expected child development, the better we can approach that in a healthy, supportive way. And then supporting the social and emotional competence of children. I think this one has the potential to break intergenerational cycles, because if you're like me, if you're around that 40 to 50 age right now, a lot of us didn't grow up in homes where we had parents asking us what we thought, how we felt, or much less cared about what we thought or how we felt about a certain situation. So we grew up being used to not tending to that part of our lives, of not really respecting the emotional realities that we have. And so a lot of us, even to this day, can be quite uncomfortable with knowing how to express an emotion, knowing how to name what we feel. And all of that could actually be improved upon with intention, support, things like therapy and meaningful conversations. But if I were to give anybody a sort of a starting point list of ways to support resilience for their family, for themselves individually, I would say focus on what's on the screen here. The bottom line is that ACEs are a risk for negative health and behavioral outcomes, not a guarantee. Secondly, the absence of ACEs actually does not guarantee flourishing or well-being. This raises the importance of what we call positive childhood experiences, or PCEs, like those family protective factors I just showed. PCEs are so important because they have a threefold benefit. They can prevent ACEs in the next generation. They can protect against the effects of ACEs if they've already occurred. And PCEs, positive childhood experiences, healthy relational connection, is the secret sauce in how we promote flourishing. And I would argue that if you're working in the human service system, if you're working in healthcare or social services, that really the goal that we want to see in the people we work with and care for is flourishing. We don't want to just remove illness or mitigate disease or disease outcomes. I want the people I care for to flourish, and to promote that requires promoting positive childhood experiences. All right, so let's go back to Ava. We learned a little bit more about her history and can get a sense that, wow, a lot of what Ava is going through is actually indirectly related to what her mother went through. That started with this fractured relationship with her father, who was abusive. And so what we did was we recognized that this behavior from Ava was not because she wanted to be delinquent or she wanted to rebel or she was just tired of her family, but that there was an underlying reason for it that very likely related to exposures of adversity and trauma. So we connected her mother and Ava. We connected Ava and her mother with our behavioral health team. We took a trauma-informed approach, which I'll talk about shortly. And we just started small. We encouraged them to just, hey, a few times a week, just eat together. You don't have to say much during the meal, but just see each other's face as you're eating. At that point in time, they were not really eating any meals together. Her mom would cook or make food or pick things up, and they would just kind of get it and separate, go back to their own rooms. Her mom, we encouraged her to establish care with a mental health provider, which she very eagerly did. She just needed a little nudge to make that happen. It was already on her mind. We asked the school to really be considerate of Ava's situation. There's a program called Handle with Care that I don't have time to explain here, but you can just Google. This is a very discreet way you can inform the school about a child without over disclosing information that could make the child feel more vulnerable. And we made them aware that Ava was going through a difficult time. I can't say at this point that every issue in Ava has been fixed, but what we do know is that after we plugged Ava into these resources and we established a healthy rapport with her mother, that things are incrementally getting better. Ava has not been suspended. Grades are still a challenge. The relationship that she has with an older teenager is still a challenge, but they are spending more time together. They're eating together more. And so there is evidence of progress. But most importantly, Ava has expressed that she feels understood by her mother in ways that she hadn't in the past 4 years. So let me talk a little bit about this thing called trauma-informed care, which is such a valuable framework in response to everything we've learned about trauma. Trauma-informed care, importantly, is not a checklist, but it's a framework. And it's a framework that is grounded in understanding what trauma is, how it affects us, and then what we can do in response to that. The way I like to think about trauma-informed care is that it's a tool that I can use that helps me maintain a perspective or a posture of unconditional positive regard, both for my patients, the people I work with, and even myself. So what's the logic behind it? Well, the main sort of premise around trauma-informed care is that instead of approaching each other with a kind of what's wrong with you attitude, when we see dysfunctional behavior or problematic behavior, we ask instead, what's happened? Or we think instead, what's happened? So in my world, when I'm seeing in clinic the person who has, and let's say I'm in my Grady clinic, I'm seeing a person who's relapsed on drugs for the fourth time, and now their heart is really suffering the consequences from it. Or I see another person who never takes her medication for diabetes reliably, or the person who's yelling in the clinic hallway because the doctor is late or the nurse is late. And there's some part of me that wants to say, chill out. Like, what is wrong with you? Trauma-informed care is asking us to don't say that, but step back, think for a second, and ask instead, what's happened? What don't we know? Because here's the logic chain. If trauma is common, and if it's linked with all sorts of mental and physical and social health problems, if what we might perceive to be the problem might actually be that person's solution or survival skill, saying what's wrong with you reactively is actually the wrong question to ask, and it could further marginalize that person who never asked for trauma in their lives in the first place. So before I go into a patient's room, or before I go to meet a person in the hospital, I will just whisper this to myself internally. And for me, it's kind of like a reset button for empathy, something I can say to myself that helps keep me grounded come what may in that encounter. There are 4 things that trauma-informed providers and institutions and really trauma-informed cultures will do. First, and these are the 4 R's. First is to realize the widespread impact of trauma, how common it is, and understand potential paths for recovery. The second R is to recognize. This is to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients and families and staff, others involved in the system. And let me expound on this a little bit. The intent here is not to assume or judge. That's actually the opposite of trauma-informed care. But if we see behavior in a patient that signals that they're in like a fight or flight mode or freeze mode, what recognize is pointing us to is to say, to resist ourselves being activated and escalating or retaliating or reacting, and then next responding with an empathetic and compassionate lens and perspective. This recognized piece is the hardest because we have to unlearn our own protective measures, our own defensiveness when we feel threatened in social situations. The last R is to avoid re-traumatization, and this can happen through really small things, like in the hospital. If I have a really stable patient who's spending the night, to try to let them sleep and to avoid unnecessary lab draws, unnecessary vital sign checks, unnecessary interruptions that will disrupt their sleep. The small things that we can do can really add up to matter. As I mentioned before, this recognize part is the hardest. But between recognize and respond is what we call the space or the pause. And I love this quote from Dr. Frankl, who wrote a phenomenal book, Man's Search for Meaning. He said that between stimulus and response is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So what this is saying is the more, even if it's just microseconds longer, the more we can pause the next time we are interacting with someone who is dysregulated, who is yelling, when we feel that urge to say, what's wrong with you? If we can pause for just a millisecond more and recognize, actually, let me not say what's wrong with you. Let me try to go with what's happened and understand that is where our growth and freedom lies. And I firmly believe that as well. Okay, so I got a couple more slides, if that's okay. And I'll wrap up. I just wanted to show you some of the guiding principles of trauma-informed care. So the 4 R's are kind of a process step of trauma-informed care. These are the guardrails. These principles are the guardrails that can frame our approach with people, whether we know about their history or not. So one important aspect about trauma-informed care is that we don't necessarily have to know a person's history to be trauma informed. In fact, I don't really, sometimes, unless there's trust established, unless I have a rapport with someone, I actually do not want to ask about their trauma until I sense that they do trust me and want to share that information with me. The two things I want to highlight here are safety and trustworthiness. Safety is so important. And I want to frame this in a neuroscientific lens. So people who don't feel safe when they're in front of us or in the four walls of our building, if they don't feel safe, they're going to be less receptive to services or therapies, because feeling unsafe or vulnerable activates that threat center of our brain, the smoke alarm of our brain, the amygdala. And when the amygdala is activated, it makes input from the thinking part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, less accessible. It's just what happens when you think about when you're driving down the highway and someone suddenly cuts you off. You don't sit there and think about what's happening. You're not like, well, that guy's cutting me off, how rude. You slam on the brakes, you swerve, you honk instantaneously. And so that's how we know that in those moments when we feel threatened, that really the thinking brain is not important to our survival in that moment. We're in that survival mode. So if a person doesn't feel safe in front of us, the same thing is happening in their brain. All that good information that we're trying to get into them, that we're trying to communicate, is not getting past their survival brain. What doesn't work when someone's upset is our efforts to be even more rational, more logical. What the person needs in that moment is a restored sense of safety and autonomy, which oftentimes means reassurance that we can be trusted. So let me talk about trustworthiness for a second. Many people who've had ACEs have had broken relationships, have been betrayed by the very people who they were supposed to be able to trust the most. So it's important that we, as human service institutions, are committed to cultivating trust, and we don't just assume that it's there by default. So what I tell my teams is, let's go in the room seeking to earn someone's trust, not just assume it's there because of our title, but let's go into and earn their trust and show them that we are trustworthy by our demeanor and our actions. And if we can take that approach, the way we talk to someone is completely different. Okay, couple last slides, some resources that support healing from trauma. This is really for teenagers and adults. The first one is having a healthy social network, relational network. Secondly, getting specific mental health treatment. That is important to creating new pathways in our brains. Support from the broader community, especially those faith communities, I think can be a really rich resource for healing from trauma. And then having your basic needs met, social stability. At the heart of all of these guiding principles of trauma-informed care are two important things to emphasize that really support healing. It's the connection, which I think I'm belaboring the point at this point, but also agency and autonomy. So if you think about people who have experienced interpersonal trauma, who are survivors of abuse in its many forms, they have had things happen to them against their consent. And so the more that we can restore that sense of, you are a person and we respect your wishes, you have a person, you have a say, you can have a say. The more we sort of uphold that dynamic, the more we can create a culture of healing. I'll just show this slide for your sake. You can pause here and do a screenshot of this, but these are some tips around how we can communicate in a trauma-informed manner, things to monitor. But basically, the bottom line here is, as we're talking to others, we try our best to stay regulated ourselves. And the beauty of that is, when we are regulated, that is our true personality that is able to come out and interface and interact with others. So really, at the heart of being trauma-informed in terms of communication is about maintaining our own self-regulation as we seek to be empathetic and compassionate in our interactions with others. Okay, two books I want to plug before I get to my summary is The book on the left by Oprah and Bruce Perry is one that I've recommended to many family members and friends. If you are looking for a read that is not super technical, but very much about the science, this is a really good one. And I've heard people really feel different after reading this book. The book on the right is by Gabor Mate and his son, called The Myth of Normal. If you're looking for how trauma has just been, how we've let trauma become normalized in our society today, this is a good book to check out. I thought it was a very fascinating read that made me kind of think differently about how we've organized our society. So let's summarize. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences that are common. They occur in clusters. They're associated with many long-term health and behavioral problems. ACEs are a cause of toxic stress, and toxic stress is that process that can lead to disruptions in brain development. Trauma often shows up not only in these discrete health outcomes, but these survival-based behaviors that, again, are not personality features, but protective mechanisms. Adversity is not destiny. Protective factors, positive childhood experiences weigh more than the traumatic ones. Trauma-informed care it starts with a very simple but profound shift of going away from what's wrong with you and towards what's happened. We talked about the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Remember that recognize R is really, really difficult, but it's so worth spending time on. And if we can elongate that space between recognize and respond, even by just a few milliseconds, therein lies our growth and our freedom. So some considerations for applying or application of these trauma-informed concepts. Before you interact with someone you're providing services for, try grounding yourself with, it's not what's wrong. No matter what happens in this conversation, let me not think it's wrong, what's wrong with you, but let me think instead what's happened. That trauma-informed communication slide has some useful suggestions. Prioritize safety, 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 because you want people to be able to open up that prefrontal cortex and not stay stuck in survival mode. And then lastly, I think it's invaluable for us ourselves to understand our own stories and how our own lives have been shaped and impacted by trauma. And a lot of times, people kind of resist this because it means looking at really painful things. What I'm not saying here is that we need to, lift up the rock altogether or pull off the scab at one time, but recognize that bit by bit, we can, with support, with therapy, with a sense of self-efficacy and autonomy, we can heal. I'll close with a quote that's one of my favorite, that's attributed to Frederick Douglass. He said that it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Thank you so much. If you've stuck with me, I know I've gone over, but thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. There's my email right there. I'd be happy to connect with you. And if you have an audience that you feel would benefit from hearing this talk, please reach out and we'll make it happen. But thanks so much. I do appreciate your time. Have a wonderful day.
As we wrap up this session, I want to remind everyone that learning does not stop here. There are additional presentations available in the breakout sessions on our website. We encourage you to explore these sessions to gain more valuable insights and practical strategies to apply in your work and communities. Thank you all for being a part of the 2024 Georgia Wellness Summit. Together, we are making strides toward a healthier and safer Georgia. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you in the breakout sessions.
Thank you all for attending the 2024 Georgia Wellness Summit. Your participation has made this inspiring and informative event a success. We appreciate your commitment to health and wellness in our community. We hope the sessions provided valuable insights to help drive positive change in women and children's health, maternal mortality, and human trafficking. Remember, you have until July 31st to submit the required information to receive your free CEUs.
Don't miss this opportunity to advance your professional development. Additionally, there are several breakout presentations available on our website. We encourage you to explore these sessions for more in-depth discussions and practical tips from our experts. Thank you once again for your dedication and engagement. Together, we are making strides toward a healthier and safer Georgia for all. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events.